Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar, A New Look at CBD and Marijuana Drug Testing. And given the number of registrations that we've had from this, I feel relatively confident in saying that you guys must be as curious and interested in this big debate of cannabis management and screening for the workplace now that we need to take a little bit broader, modern approach there. So we're really glad that you're here and that you've joined us today. In case we haven't met, my name is Holly Foxworth. I am a registered nurse. I'm a marketing manager for content. And I have a fantastic panel that is joining us today. We have Senior Vice President of Behavioral Health for Axiom. And I don't even know why I just blanked on your name, Les. Like, I don't even know what happens. Yeah. Anyways, yeah. So we have Dr. Les Curte. We also have our Chief Marketing Officer, Dara Wheeler. And then we also have a special guest that I don't think that you guys have met before, but she is VP of Partnerships for Hound Labs, and that is Jaime Feinberg. So you will get to meet them shortly. But before we get to that, let's talk through what comes next. So if you look at the top of your screen at the right side, there should be a blue button that should get your attention that will say register here. And so what we're going to be doing is having a large mega size event for this next year. I guess we're going to refer to that in Starbucks terms. We go straight from grande to venti. So it'll be a larger time period that we'll be covering some content. And that is going to be with Natasha Bowman. Some of you have met her before, but she is nationally recognized as one of the largest voices for mental health and equality in the workplace. And so the name of that event is, Am I the Only One That's Struggling with Mental Illness in the Workplace? She has such a powerful story, and it's, even if you've heard it before, she has multiple things that have came up and talking about the different experiences that she's had with other organizations or with apps and things of that sort, and kind of how difficult it's been to navigate some of those. So I think that she will bring a lot of information that you can take back to your workforce and be able to implement some of those programs and maybe best practice suggestions moving forward. In addition to that, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a resource section that's there that has a copy of all of the slide decks that we will use today. But in addition to that, we also have one that's specific to Hound Labs. And so that is their full deck. It gives you additional information about their process, about what we're going to be talking about today, what that looks like, et cetera. So you're welcome to have those two resources there for further reference. And then lastly, I love to hear from you. I say it every time. We give great gifts, but your questions really matter. And we like to have those fed throughout the entire event. So the more questions you ask, the better that these events go. We learn from each other. This topic, we understand, is a little bit sensitive and nobody wants to ask for themselves. So if you need to ask for a friend, you need to ask for a friend a question about marijuana or what shows up, what doesn't show up, please don't hesitate to type those questions in there. And I don't have to say your name if you would prefer to remain anonymous. So definitely type those questions in as you receive them. And we usually try to cover those throughout the broadcast. But if for some reason we didn't get to them, within that section, then we'll cover it at the end. So I think that's all I have for announcements. Let's go ahead and just meet the team. Dr. Curte, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Les Curte. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I've had about a little over 45 years of clinical experience. I've spent the last 20 plus years mostly in corporate settings focused on workplace mental health and disability work comp, and I've been with Axiom for the last 2 years. And really pleased to be here. I'm Senior VP for Behavioral Health, as Holly had said.
Thank you, guys. And Dara, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Holly. I feel targeted yet again since I'm sitting here with a Starbucks cup. Participating in the other, big addiction in America, which is caffeine. However, it's great to be here. My name is Dara Wheeler. I'm Axiom's Chief Marketing Officer. I've been at Axiom for 17 years, working on building programs for employers, including drug and alcohol programs, And I'm also really excited to introduce our guest today, Jaime Feinberg. I've known Jaime for a long time, and the work that Hound Labs is doing is really exciting. So I'm glad that she's here to join us. Jaime, if you want to introduce yourself.
I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me. And yes, I am Jaime Feinberg, VP of Partnerships for Hound Labs. I've been with Hound Labs for about a year. Prior to that, I spent most of my professional career as a safety and risk professional, working starting out as a safety coordinator in a manufacturing facility, all the way up through my previous role as a VP of risk control in the insurance industry. So happy to be here. I know this is a hot topic, which is the reason why I went over to Hound Labs, because I know, this was stuff that we dealt with every single day. So I look forward to, talking through this with everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Jaime, and thank you for all three of you for joining us today. I can appreciate, and I assume that the audience does as well, to be able to have a safe place to talk about some of these things that are a little bit uncomfortable sometimes to discuss, especially when it comes to the workforce. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to go through, kind of an outline, we'll talk about substance abuse. We're going to be talking about some of the testing trends, employer impact, why we even need drug testing in the first place, some of the new technology solutions, and then we will wrap that up with best practice policies. So Dara, actually, I'm going to come to you first. What we'll do is I put it in a poll question here. And so we'll look at the results later in the broadcast, but you should see on your screen, there's a question there, a poll question that asks, what types of drug testing do you do? And so you can choose multiple answers, but if you would take the time to do that for us, that would be fantastic. Dara, so while we're working on the poll there, did that go away, or do you still see it?
Mm-hmm.
Did it go away?
We can see yeah, it's gone.
Okay. I tell you what, why don't we go back, and that way that'll give everybody a chance. Looks like we've got about 106. Here we go. All right. We're getting some great answers. Dara, well, I will leave that up for another few seconds while we do that, but I'll come to you first and just saying that, one of the quotes that came up whenever we look at modern day challenges here was specifically the issues that employers are having to face. And Jaime, actually, I pulled this from your website, that the quote that had said, we just had a hiring event where nearly 70 people had shown up. And after we told them that they would be tested with THC, most of them did not show up the next day, and a few failed the drug test that they'd given, which resulted in 100% loss of all of their candidates that day at the job fair. What's your thoughts, Dara? Does that seem to make sense to you? How do we navigate this, and where do we go from here?
Yeah, we're hearing more and more stories like this, and I'm sure Jaime's got quite a few that they're hearing too. Hiring challenges in these various roles, especially safety-sensitive roles, are becoming a really challenging situation for a lot of employers right now, and they're having to shift policies. Now, we know that there's a difference between a company policy versus a federal policy. We recognize that. I know we're going to have lots of questions about the difference between federal mandates versus state mandates or company mandates. So federally, marijuana is still illegal from a federal standpoint. And so if you have a company that has federally mandated programs, regulated programs like Department of Transportation, there are still very strict testing requirements for those roles. However, when we look at legalization changing across states, what you're being faced with is the fact that legally it may be required or decriminalized within a state or an area, but yet we're still faced with challenges with impairment in the workplace, and also employees that are federally regulated through various programs. So it's an interesting situation for HR and for compliance officers and others to be dealing with, and is bringing with it a host of challenges like this hiring challenge around, informing people about drug testing policies and then losing candidates. This map up here, we've got over 42% of our states, I think, have legalized marijuana. And when we've looked at kind of the progress here, we're in the second decade of this legalization process for recreational use. But then, so it has become much more accessible for adults to use. And then we did see a bit of a pandemic impact when employees were now working remote and at home versus being in the office and having less structure in their days. We did see some use increase and drug test positivity increase. Actually, and I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we did see some changes there. And then because of legalization, methods have changed with edibles and some other ways of getting access. And then, of course, the difference between marijuana, THC, and CBD products is kind of always a gray one. We had, I think, our last webinar about this last year specifically addressed the difference between CBD and how to kind of manage through some of those challenges, and how much THC may or may not be included in products. So I think this just lays the situation out and the scenarios out that we're facing as employers and as our partner clients are facing with what to do with all of this. You know, if a company is in Texas like we are, but has employees in multiple states where marijuana may be legal, like Colorado, California, what do you do? How do you manage policy? How do you go about changing or thinking about the way we approach drug testing in the workplace?
Absolutely, yeah. What did you say that the number was about how many people that now have access to this?
To the percentage of state?
Yeah, like 40, I think, wasn't it like 42%?
134 million, yeah, 134 million adults. And of course, that's, you know, assuming that you're staying within your state lines. And I'm sure there's also people crossing state lines with products as well. So there, and then you know, who knows about mail order and a whole black market, I'm sure, on that side of things. But so access, you know, best case scenario, we're saying maybe 134 million adults have access to legalized drugs that they may not have 10 years ago.
Yeah, these questions are already starting to pour in. I think we may get to a few of them in some of the content, but we'll go ahead and just kind of show the results here. So I'm kind of taken aback by the amount of testing that's being done and all the different types. So it looks like that predominantly the pre-employment is what is being done, but also the other ones, maybe not the random, but the post-accident and also reasonable suspicion. It looks like those are pretty consistent. Jamie, is that what you guys are seeing as well on your end?
This is actually, you know, I mean, obviously I knew pre-employment was going to be high. I think everybody's still pretty much doing that. The random really struck me, like that was actually much higher than I thought it was going to do. And as a safety and risk professional, that makes me super happy because that's where you're going to get some of the deterrence and some of that risk mitigation going on there. So, so I really enjoyed seeing those numbers there. I had to write them down really fast. I was like, "Ooh, those are some good numbers there." I like seeing that. So kudos to your audience there for making this safety and risk girl happy on this. What is it? Thursday afternoon.
Happiness on a Thursday. We aim to please, Ms. Feinberg. Yep. Yes. All right. Well, I'll come to you next then, Dr. Curtay. Talk us through kind of what some of these trends are that we're seeing. What are these numbers looking like?
Well, you know, I mean, if you just take a look at the map and the extent to which legal access has increased, you know, it makes perfect sense that we're going to see substantial increases in test positivity rates across these various things. You know, and you can see the numbers here in terms of the amount of increase in test positive rates for marijuana. I think what's really the one that really has got my attention as I dug into these numbers, it's important to recognize that these numbers in absolute numbers are relatively small to begin with. So the increases are talking to us about a trend. You know, it's not that 64% of people test positive. I want to be clear about what these numbers mean, but they are trending up. And the one that really got my attention is the test positivity rates in post-accident or post-incident, they are quite high in comparison to pre-employment and even random testing. And they are increasing over time quite significantly. So what that tells me is that we are in fact seeing impairments in people who are using, and they're leading to safety incidents. Or that's a reasonable conclusion. I mean, it's not a causal connection, but it's certainly a reasonable conclusion when we see that there's such a much larger number of people testing positive post-incident than in other circumstances. So, I mean, this is the reason why we're all concerned, right? This is the reason that for safety sake, we're worried about this. You know, otherwise it makes sense because we see that there's more access, but that safety issue is really, I think, important to underline.
For sure. So Dara, then when we look at the impact for employers, what kind of challenges come up?
Yeah, and actually I was just gonna kind of lay some context down. I think a lot of those on the call probably are familiar with a lot of this. I know Jamie will go over it a little bit too, but there's been inherent challenges with drug testing policies forever. There's a lot of challenges. Yes, there's the DOT and the federally mandated, which are very particular. Company regulated programs for drug and alcohol testing have always been a little bit, they're troublesome for a lot of reasons, because you really are trying to get, we're talking about safety. Jamie came from a background of safety. We work with companies that are very safety sensitive. They're concerned about heavy equipment, employees working in scenarios that are unsafe potentially or risky. And there are a lot of companies out there that work with heavy equipment, that work with these risky environments that are not federally regulated and it required to do certain testing. And so you have a wide range of company policies and ways of implementing these different types of programs. And that in itself, in adherence to policy, is really risky in and of itself, because setting up a policy, building a company, and making sure that you're fairly handling testing is a really important way to think about this. And I know Jamie can talk a little bit about where we've come from and where we're going, but we used to have this thought of kind of zero tolerance in the workplace, especially in risky or safety sensitive roles. And we're in a place where that's a much more gray area. What is zero tolerance anymore? How do we manage that? What do we mean by that? So when we look at these questions around what will impact employers around recruitment, retention, and wrongful termination, even before legalization, these were challenges. So 10 years ago, these were still challenges for organizations that were drug testing or had a drug testing policy because of consistencies and adhering to policy. Now we're in a place where it's not just challenging, it's almost impossible as you look across state lines, and especially for national corporations. Finding qualified candidates today in general is tough, especially when you're looking at some of these roles. And then when you're looking at these various policies and adhering to them correctly, making sure that you have good advice on how to create a policy and administer it's really important for employers. I'll pause there. Les or Jamie, anything else you want to say about that?
I'll just add, I'm watching the questions roll in, and we're going to get to these questions in a lot of ways, but one of the questions, of course, is, well, most of the current testing has been long-term use because it's measuring things that stay in the blood for a long period of time. So it creates a real problem when you have medically approved uses, when you have other circumstances. It's really it's creating a huge problem, and we're going to get to that. I want to reassure people who are asking those questions, but that's really the issue. You know, as you legalize even if it's just medical use, not let alone recreational use, you know, you're going to see positive testing, and that may or may not indicate acute use or impairment. So that's where we got to get to.
We did have a statement, I guess it was kind of a question and statement that it came in, and it said, I conduct pre-employment, random, post-accident, and reasonable suspicion in a state that marijuana is legal. We no longer consider marijuana as a positive result. I'm in a distribution center with MHE whipping around, and 95% of the drug tests that come back positive for marijuana, and there's no repercussions for their employees. So that says a lot. I appreciate you sharing that and disclosing it, you know, because I think that these are key pieces of information that other organizations need to hear, and your colleagues, and to kind of understand where they are. Jaime, talk us through, let's move on to you and just kind of talk about our why, on why it is that we even started drug testing in the first place.
Yeah, so the whole point is, you know, as I came here, you know, you're always talking about detection. Well, we did this test and we caught them. They had it in their system. Well, that really isn't the purpose. It was never really the purpose of drug testing. The real purpose of it was to deter, right? To deter use during the workday, to deter use, you know, before, you know, operating that vehicle, to deter use. So that's really what we need to get back to is, you know, what type of policy do we want to have? Do you want to deter people from using, especially if it's legal in your state, right? If it's something that's legal, do you want to deter them from using during the workday? Or are you going to wait until something happens or you have reasonable suspicion, and then you're going to have some sort of testing that, you know, is going to do, you know, have that detection purpose? And so I really think that, you know, having both is probably the right way to go, right? But really, especially from a safety risk mitigation standpoint, that, you know, going back to that deterrence is all about it. We're all about preventing, right? If we're only going for detection, then that's a lagging indicator. It's already happened. It's already walked through somebody's already walked through your door with it in their system. But this is where kind of that burden comes in, right? For a lot of us, is that with conventional testing methods that we have now, you don't know. And as Dr. Les said, is it causation, or, you know, or is it correlation, right? And so you really want to be looking at it from a standpoint of, you know, when did they use, not, you know, that it's just in their system. And so that's really what we're trying to get our heads wrapped around, and helping employers wrap their heads around that.
So when you move then to talking about use, and you look at the spectrum there, I know we've talked about, we all know that, like, we have the BAC for alcohol use. We have some of these standard measurements, but does that exist for marijuana?
At this point, there isn't a impairment standard. There isn't a, you know, a limit per se. We were actually just talking about this on a call the other day with some auto insurance carriers. And it was, you know, talking about, you know, those per se limits. And if you have one leg in Utah and one leg in, you know, Colorado, and you blow a 0.05 here and a 0.08 here, in one place you're having a DUI and the other you're not. So, you know, so it's those standards kind of can get a little confusing as well, right? But really what we're trying to look at here is, you know, when did they use, and you know, how do you detect that, right? And so when you're looking at this slide here, you can kind of see how those different windows of detection work, right? With those different testing methodologies. And with breath testing, you're only capturing active THC in the breath for about 2 to 3 hours after consuming. I always use the word consuming because there's so many different ways of using marijuana, but after consuming or ingesting a cannabis product. Where with oral fluid, it could be up to 72 hours, urine up to a month, hair up to 3 months, which is more of like a lifestyle test that we're starting to see, you know, people are using as well. So that's where we're with breath technology, we're really looking at, that workday and narrowing it down so that employers, if it's legal and they're using, how do you narrow it down to that workday? Very similar to, I'm sure, your alcohol policies, right? You can't use alcohol during the workday. You can't use prior. There's probably some time limits on when they can, have alcohol prior to, entering work. It's going to start being, we're starting to see more and more employers have policies that are mirroring, those alcohol policies as well when it comes to legalized cannabis.
Yeah, agreed. This may be a good time to ask some of these questions that are flowing in. Mm-hmm. Let's see, Candace was asking about, is the breath technology available today or is it coming?
It is coming very, very soon. And so we will be launching our technology this year. Our first technology that we will be rolling out with is our collect and send. So that will be where you will do the breath capture. You'll do a breath collection on site. You can either do it at your facility or we'll have some occupational health or lab based where you can actually go and have them conduct the test for you. And then those will all of those samples will then be sent to our laboratory partner, which is Quest Diagnostics, for all of the initial lab testing as well as any confirmatory testing. If there was a non-negative test where THC was detected, it'll also go through that confirmatory testing process. Mm-hmm. Next year, in 2024, we'll actually be rolling out with an on-demand system where it'll be more of an instrument read. You'll have results, within minutes of taking that sample, collecting that sample. So lots of things coming on that. We've actually it's really exciting. I've been with the company for a year. They've been at this since 2014, getting everything perfected, and we're, getting ready to roll out this year. And we've actually just announced our first ship dates to some of our very first early adopters. And so really excited for that. So yeah, it's really fun and exciting. It's cool to be a part of something that I know is going to help bring, safety and fairness back to the workplace, and especially that safety piece, right? Yeah. So there you can kind of see, just some things on, what we're looking at. And, we were talking a little bit about, deterrence versus detection. This works for both, right? No matter how you want to do that. And also, it really is going to help support your employee policies, prohibiting workday use. Really going to be, making, if you choose to use, that's a private thing, right? And it goes back to that fairness. So you want to just make sure that, employees are having that feeling that they can, things that they choose to do outside of work, stays there as opposed to, well, if they're using it legally, right? I always have to have that caveat, right? If it's legal in your state and you're using it legally, then, that should, be your choice, and it shouldn't be impacting your, hopefully not impacting your work status with your organization if you're using responsibly.
Mm-hmm. One of the other statements that I really liked from your organization was the question posed of, is it really fair to penalize an employee on Monday morning for something they legally participated in on Friday night? I think that says a lot. Yeah,
it does. Yeah. It does, and it really goes back to there's a lot of when you brought up the fact of safety sensitive and having some of those and even that we expanding our thought process of what is safety sensitive. I remember when I first started out in safety, we used to see all these banners that said safety's everyone's responsibility. But then when it comes to drug testing, we're only testing those people who are driving a forklift, or with the in the warehouse, or we're not testing the people in the office, right? So you're having this equity and this imbalance there. And so if employers really want to be fair and really want to have it, and really, to be honest, keep themselves out of legal trouble, right? That you really want to have this program where it really is encompassing all employees and really not looking at safety sensitive, and really looking at too is it from a risk standpoint, is it any more risky for somebody to be driving a forklift under the influence, right, of cannabis or any substance, right, as it is to let's say, an engineer who is designing a bridge under the, you know what I mean? So it's kind of shifting that mindset, right? Of, what's really more risky, right? One maybe has more of a acute, risk to it, and another one has maybe could have longer term ramifications, and maybe not something you're going to see right away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to ask Dr. Kurte if he could talk a little bit about impairment. I don't mean to like put you on the spot, Les, but if you could talk a little bit about why do we care about impairment on the job? What are some of the risks? And we've mentioned safety as a component of risk, but could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, in general terms, I mean, there's a lot of research that's been going on and that continues to go on, but things that we know associated with cannabis, particularly with THC, are quite similar to alcohol. Impairment is slowed reaction time, impairment in executive function, so judgment, decision making, all of those things can be impaired, and that's why we care, right? If my frontal lobes are not working properly and I'm making poor decisions, I'm a safety risk. That's kind of like period, full stop. I'm a safety risk if I'm not able to reliably make good judgments and decisions. And we know that's the case. We know that that's the case with alcohol. We also know that it's the case with cannabis. What's missing in THC at this point, even with this kind of detection, what's missing is the standard. There's a legal standard for how much alcohol you can have. We don't have that same standard yet for THC. But if we can detect workday use with breath technology, and it certainly looks really, really promising, then we can begin to have that conversation like, hey, I don't care what you do at night. I don't care what you do at home. I do care that you don't come to work when your judgment is impaired and your reaction time is slowed. I'm giving you two examples. We also know that there are longer term impacts of heavy use. There are longer term impacts on short-term memory, on working memory, on the ability to consolidate short-term memory to long-term memory. All of those things are impacted by chronic heavy use. So we also know all of that. The problem up to this point has been, where do we draw the line? And what's potential here is the ability to draw the line of, okay, I do care what you do while you're at work. I hope that's answering the question that you were getting at, Dara.
Yeah, and I think there was a follow-up question that I think is really a really good point, and I want you to kind of weigh in on that too, which is, couldn't impairment also be associated with other prescribed drugs that we may not be testing for, such as legal or prescription drugs, as opposed to marijuana? And I think that's exactly the point of the limitations of these policies. A lot of you may have heard of a 5-panel or a 6-panel. These various panels, you can do expanded panels up to a 10-panel that gather different types of drugs that are common use. But again, where are the limits, and how do you manage a program appropriately? And you can kind of hear I get excited about this. And the reason I get excited about this is because you're exactly right that somebody could be impaired using a prescription medication on the job. And that's another critical area to be aware of for the exact reason. And I think somebody else asked this, and Jamie might have some better data on this. The other issue is setting the limit. So like Les said, we may not have standards yet. There have always been challenges about how to measure positivity. How positive are you? I've had how many employers ask me, well, the employee was positive. How positive? Well, what do you mean how positive? They were positive.
A little bit positive or a lot positive.
Yes, how pregnant are you, right? It's just like, they're pregnant, yes or no? Like, well, how pregnant is she?
Yeah, it's exactly. So but these are the types, they sound so funny, but these are all of these nuances to these policies that are really difficult to implement. And so when you think about these types of questions about how positive is somebody, it really is something that I feel for all of us as employers, because these nuances are really difficult. So this is another one of those, the age-old issue with some marijuana testing, which was, oh, I just inhaled, I inhaled somebody else's exhale and now I'm positive. Well, again, levels and understanding what we're testing, the 10 panels, the 5 and 6 panels, depending upon what the sensitivity of the test, all of these different components go into these policies, which make it really challenging to implement. And I know I didn't give an answer other than, yes, we should be also paying attention to medication use on the job as well.
Oh, I agree with that too, wholeheartedly. I mean, look at any type of medication. It could be over the counter or prescription, and there's a million different warnings on it. I mean, even, it's going to be allergy season, so maybe sooner for some of you in your country. I'm in Illinois here. It's still a bit cold for allergy season. But I mean, your run-of-the-mill Benadryl, right? Like it's, can cause, drowsiness, can cause, don't operate, machinery, until you know how this is going to affect you. I mean, a lot of things are out there, but are we checking for those things? And it really just becomes a, how do you manage it on a day-to-day basis? Right. It's really a struggle.
I mean, I think that I would add that we, generally speaking, have a problem measuring functional capacity related to, particular tasks, right? We're not terribly good at it. And that's the ultimate thing that would tell us, like, do we have a problem or not? Whether you smoked marijuana or took a prescription drug or whatever, can we identify that there's impairment in this particular function that's relevant to the job? We're not very good at that. And I grant that. Nevertheless, do we allow, if we have the technology and it's reliable enough, if we have the technology to detect a substance that we know causes some degree of impairment, do we not use it because there are all these other things that might also cause impairment, right? It's like,
right.
Again, we don't allow people to come to work drunk, so perhaps we ought to be applying a similar kind of standard to cannabis, despite the fact that we also have other problems that need to get solved.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and to that point, I mean, it's there's a lot of people right now that are just throwing their hands up and saying, we're just not going to test anymore, and that's kind of, I call it the ostrich approach, right? I'm just going to bury my head in the sand and hope for the best, which as like I said, as a safety and risk professional, it makes me cringe a little bit, but a lot of companies, they're just at a loss for that and they don't know what to do, and so that's their best solution right now. And so we really are trying to help educate people on, bringing, if they have removed testing, whether it's total drug testing or just for, cannabis, how do you start bringing that back into your workplace drug testing policies, and what's the right way to do that?
Yeah, absolutely. We had a follow-up comment about an employee having disclosed to HR partner if they are taking medication that has risk language around operating machinery or stuff like that. And I just, as a side comment, we do run a ton of medication review programs for clients for that exact reason. So employees are revealed to us as a medical third party what they're being prescribed for, and we make sure to review symptoms or side effects with them to make sure it's appropriate. To Les's point about functional capacity and understanding whether it will impair somebody on the job or not.
Yeah.
Holly, I cut you off.
No, it's okay. There was a good question that I saw come in a little bit earlier, and it probably would be a good time to address it. We're asking, what's the difference between THC and cannabis? Who wants to take that one? Not all at the same time.
Don't all of us jump at once.
THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, is, and there are various forms. That's a whole other webinar that we could spend time on that would put everybody to sleep. Essentially, it's the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana. Cannabis really tends to refer to, most of the time when people say cannabis, sometimes they just mean THC, but most of the time what we mean is all of the various compounds that are found in marijuana in that plant. And so that's the short answer to that question.
Okay.
And if I'm going to do an organic chemistry lecture, I need a little more time to prepare.
No worries, no worries. I tell you what, let's go ahead and talk about best practice policies, because there's so many questions here that are kind of similar. So why don't we split this up? Dara, talk us through fairness. You've been in HR. Could this be a wrongful termination as people move forward with legalization in the different states? Is that a risk?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Jaime even said it for companies that are saying they're safety sensitive, but only applying a drug testing policy to those operating machinery versus somebody that may be in an office setting. So really taking a hard look, and we're not legal advisors. You should have your own legal team or HR advisors. However, there are very risky ways to implement these types of policies. There's a lot of ways not to do it. And you do have to be really careful to make sure that you're being equitable and fair in your policy treatment, just like any other policy within an organization. We've had a lot of questions about the differences between states. And so that is very difficult if you're operating multi-state, and there's a lot of differences between random testing policies by state, and reasonable suspicion practices, and some other ways of handling some of those components. I know somebody mentioned California and random testing not being allowed. I know there's quite a few other states as well. So if you are operating within multiple states, some companies do state-by-state policies, but again, you have to be kind of thinking about how that affects your overall culture and company. So I can't always answer to a company's culture, but I do think it is really important to make sure that you're getting a lot of advice, good advice on this, because you could end up finding yourself within some areas that you don't want to be dealing with that are legal ramifications. I just want to say one other thing that is really just kind of always, Jaime said, her heart with her old safety and risk background and my old HR background. The thing that I always fall back to, if you have random programs, reasonable suspicion programs, all of these different programs built to, think about impairment versus prevention, and kind of these different reasons we have drug and alcohol testing policies. A lot of employers struggle with how to manage a reasonable suspicion program. How do we know if an employee is using on the job? How do we know if they're impaired while working? And this is something that has to come with a lot of training and communication from HR across the organization. So if you have a reasonable suspicion policy within your drug testing policy, make sure that you're getting trained on how to implement that correctly, because that is absolutely one of the riskiest areas of implementing it incorrectly and targeting employees unfairly. And so what I usually advise, and again, I'm not your HR team and I'm not your legal team, but is to think about this more from a behavioral standpoint. And I know Les and I have talked a lot about this in other webinars. So when you look at whether their usual behavior, that's the best way to pay attention to this type of situation. What is the trend with that employee? Are they normally somebody that shows up at 8 a.m., ready to work, looking great, ready to go? And then all of a sudden there's a trend where, they're showing up late for a week. They seem like they're not groomed as much as they used to be. And you don't have to necessarily know whether they are using or not, but you can address behavior. And so that is one of those areas that if you can implement good communication from a performance-based approach, you don't even necessarily need to drug test an employee in that scenario. And it doesn't really matter, because you're looking at people's behavior over time and trying to help them from that standpoint, from a behavioral standpoint. So that's my soapbox. Les or Jaime, any pieces about that?
I was going to ask Les, could you speak to the policies and psychological safety? That's a word, a phrase, I guess I should say, that is coming up a lot recently, is psychological safety. How would you define that, and why is that important when you're looking at some of these policies?
Well, there's a couple of aspects to psychological safety, but the main thing is this an environment in which it's safe to take take risks, to question the status quo, and to self-disclose about mental health challenges, substance use, prescriptions. If I tell you that I'm taking a particular prescription, is that going to get me fired? That's a psychological safety question. But also, if I question the boss and think that I have a better idea about how to get something done, am I going to be reprimanded, or am I going to be ostracized for that, or criticized for it? And we think of, there's a lot of different ways to think about it, but the thing is that people who feel like as if they're in a psychologically safe environment feel that it's safe for them, that they're valued as a person, and that their coworkers, including their managers, that their coworkers won't undermine their efforts. Those are kind of the key principles. And that it has huge implications. Teams where psychological safety is high are much more likely to be innovative, to come up with new ideas, to come up with process improvements, productivity increases. That has all of these measurable effects. In this context, it's probably related to, if I acknowledge that I have an issue with chronic use of a substance, what's going to happen to me, right? It's not an anything goes free ticket, don't pass go, don't collect $200, go straight to jail. It's not a get out of jail free card, but it is but part of putting policies in place has to be that it makes it a safe environment for people to talk about what's actually going on and what they see, and to address concerns about changes in performance, to the point of what Dara was making. If we see somebody is acting differently, can we talk about that? Can we have that conversation, right? All of that is subsumed into psychological safety.
Yeah. Great. We've got lots of questions, so I'm going to do rapid fire and just kind of go between the three of you, if that's okay. Let's see. Earlier on, we had Kurt was mentioned, as marijuana and other drugs is becoming so widespread across the country, with many of the states legalizing recreational use, are companies going to be forced to change their stance on marijuana? I think we've covered this from a larger perspective, but anything else anybody wants to add there? I think it definitely needs to be looked at. I think we may see some changes. What's your thoughts, Jamie?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And we're seeing it every day where, you had the quote at the beginning, right? Where 70% of their 70 of their candidates that they came, were disqualified. They left. They lost all their candidates. So I think that there is going to be some turning points on this. We've seen some really good, some ROIs on these things, and talking to some of our prospective customers. We're seeing that with employee retention, right? So you've now got this candidate in, right? You spent money to recruit. How do you retain them, right? So it's basically, we're seeing some numbers here. We do have a really great cost savings calculator. The National Safety Council also has a really good cost saving, or calculators around this. But what we're seeing from some of these is that 21% of annual wages are being spent on recruiting and training a new employee. That's a ton of money, right? There's we're seeing like a 10% probability that a wrongfully terminated employee for failing a drug test will file a lawsuit, right? So that's another thing where people are, what are we looking at here? So if we're only having these zero tolerance policies in a legal state, like how are we? They're gonna be forced to adapt to these because of some of these things, and especially with the tight labor market, not only for just your safety sensitive and all these different workforce issues. But we're also starting to see too that even employees that are under federally mandated, especially under DOT, there was a great article that just came out, and it was showing that there was a huge increase in positivity, in THC positivity among truckers, which there's already a shortage there, right? So
Right.
and so now there's all these issues that are just arising. So there has to be some sort of changes, whether it's at the federal level. I think we put the cart before the horse by legalizing. I'm not for or against, but and not having laws
Right.
and some of these methodologies ready to be able to handle, what do we do now? I think we're catching up, obviously, but
Yeah.
it really has been a predicament for a lot of people, whether it's the employers and the employees. So.
And one thing that I think Jamie and Les, you both have dealt with in your past lives too, we never even mentioned work comp costs associated with some of these situations either. I'm assuming those are pretty high.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. You were saying
being the average. Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's not. The funny thing is in my experience is that there's not a ton of great numbers out there right now coming out from the insurance carriers on how much it's costing them from it, but we know that it is, right? Average workers comp cost right now is $41,000. National Safety Council did a survey in 2021, and they were saying that these companies who were removing THC from their panels, we're then starting to see an increase in their workplace safety, decreases in their productivity. So there's numbers out there. There's not like a direct. I mean, we've scoured research on this to see if there's any direct numbers, but you can do the math there and know that if there's an increase, in safety incidents that after they've removed THC from their panels, that it's causing some heartburn in the work comp arena there, and so that's where we're also working and trying to partner with some insurance companies and to be able to help look at some of those numbers and to really get some good data out there so that we can make some big impacts with that as well.
Yeah,
wonderful. We had a question that was asking if someone they were talking about the cutoffs for THC. And so they were asking about when it goes to the MRO, and they wanted to know when the MRO contacts the employee and the employee has a medical card, will the result be reported to the employer as positive by the MRO?
If they're in a DOT program, it depends on the level.
Don't they call it
usually
not negative or something like that? There's some kind of formal phrase. It seems like
a lot of this is policy dependent and level dependent. Right. But as far as I remember, Jamie, I'm probably speaking out of turn there, but I'm pretty sure that if they have a medical card, but it just depends on the policy and the levels on how the MRO will handle reporting a positive.
Great. Okay. And Alicia, thank you for that question and sharing kind of what's going on with you guys there. And yes, this is being recorded and we can follow up with you afterwards as well. Let's see. How do you manage this for organizations that exist globally?
Very carefully. Very carefully, right?
I mean, to Jamie's point, this wave of legalization got out way ahead of our understanding on our ability to manage safety questions. We should have been answering all of those questions before we started legalizing across the board. We're having a hard enough time catching up inside the United States. So, much less in the global marketplace. I mean, it's the same set of problems. The safety questions are the ultimate question that we need to be able to answer. What's a level of impairment? Unfortunately, we don't have good answers.
Yeah. And that's really where. Oh, sorry, Holly. I was just going to say that's where really having a good relationship with whether it's internal counsel or external legal counsel, having good relationships there. And there are so many employment law firms out there now that have cannabis practices that this is what they do. So, look for, if you really have questions about that, they have practices that are are specific to this. And so, I would definitely seek them out and make sure that you're dotting all your I's and crossing all your T's when it comes to that. Whether it's you have, employees in different states, it could even be in different jurisdictions within the states. And then obviously once you start a local ball game, then.
Let's see. Somebody was asking, according to the National Library of Medicine, since small amounts of cannabis continue to be released from fat into the blood long after short-term impairment wears off, this method has not been promoted. Is that true today? Dr. Kurte, you have anything to add there?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay.
I think they might have been speaking to blood testing or other types of testing I think, I mean, that's part of the reason Hound Labs has created their version because of exactly that reason.
Right.
Yeah.
And that is a Jamie question as to, the extent to which there are false positives, false negatives, all of that within the testing. No testing is perfect.
Right.
End of story, right? I mean, it just doesn't happen. But I mean, that's the problem with all of the other forms of testing because of that long, slow release from fatty tissues. Question is, what we're looking for is this short-term, the ability to detect more immediate use.
Right. And so with the technology, it's detecting the active THC molecules, not metabolites. So it's not after the fact. And the technology is 1 billion times more sensitive than an alcohol breathalyzer. And like we said, active THC is only going to stay detectable in the breath for around, for a few hours, for about 3 hours. And so I think that's where you kind of are, where we can kind of narrow that down. We'll have much more greater detail on that and from some of the specificity and sensitivity once we launch our product. And that will all be, on there. We've done, I think at last time I checked, it was like over 10,000 human subject testing on our technology on the breath sampling. So we know that the breath sampling works, and you can check out some of the clinical studies that we've done on our website, which is really cool. Again, getting back into that science part, we could have a whole day, a whole class on the chemistry part of it. But I mean.
Let's see, Jody was saying, since marijuana can be detected currently beyond 30 days from use, if someone had a prescription for marijuana and test positive post-accident, how will that detection reasonably be correlated to the incident? I don't think it can or it should be.
It's not.
Yeah.
Which is the challenge. And so.
And what comes to, I mean, in a lot of cases, it's got to be proximate cause, right? You have to be able to prove that it was the proximate cause of that incident, right? So, and with current testing methodologies, it's very hard to do that. Nearly, I mean, impossible.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's important.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Les.
I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a problem that we need to solve. Because if in fact the test positive rate post-incidence is substantially higher than other times we test, we have reason to believe that there is a relationship between marijuana use and safety incidents. So the fact of the matter, we have to be able to measure acute use, which breathalyzer looks like it has the potential to be able to do, to draw a causal conclusion. But it's certainly reasonable if you look at the numbers. There's no other conclusion we can draw but that there is a relationship. What that relationship is, and is it proximal cause or not, we don't know. But we do know there's a relationship.
Yeah, when we do look at some of those numbers too, is one question that came to me is, I want to compare the companies that are doing the random, right, to the companies that are also doing post-accident. And compare apples to apples, right? Because you could have a company who's doing random, right? But not doing post-accident or vice versa. So is one leading to the other? Are the companies who are doing random, are they having less positives post-accident? I would like to say that I would think hopefully yes, because that's where you're getting the deterrence from. But there's not a lot of actual available data out there that I know of that's showing that relationship as well.
Right.
We're out of time, but there's one question that keeps coming up throughout this whole feed, and that is, and Jamie, I'm going to come to you for it, and it was asking, are edibles, let's see, would edibles be detected by the breathalyzer?
Yeah, so it's because of the fact that it's looking for the active THC molecules. It's not looking for any type of residual in the mouth or anything like that, or the smoke or anything like that. That yes, once the THC or cannabis products are consumed and THC hits the bloodstream, it's then going to be respirated back out through the breath. So it may take a little bit longer for it to get into the breath because obviously the digestive process for it to hit the bloodstream. And, you know, if you've talked to anybody who's ever taken an edible and was like, hey, this isn't working, and then they decide to take another one, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh gosh, what happened? That's why it will take a little bit longer. And I'm speaking, you know, that was from a friend who told me that happens. So, you know, that's the reason why that it will be a little bit delayed as far as once it will hit the breath from there.
Yeah. Guys, we're at time. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to follow up with each of you. I don't think that we've ever had this many questions on a webinar. So this is, if anything, it gives me encouragement that there's a lot of interest here and that there's a lot of you who are committed to getting it right, to making this a process that can work for the employer and for the employees and maintain that psychologically safe environment. So if you haven't already, press that blue button to get registered for the Am I the Only One that's struggling with mental health in the workplace for this next month. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you.
Thank you.